Hello guys, my name is Venon Insofa, and in today's video we are going to look at this biochemistry past paper. This is biochemistry quiz 1 that was written in 2022. But before we go further, let me extend my words of gratitude to Dr. James Makin King Koloma, who sponsored and made it possible for us to have this video today. So in this video today, we are going to look at this biochemistry quiz 1 that was written in 2022. This biochemistry quiz 1 was focusing on the transport across the cell membrane. So in this video, I'm going to teach you how you're supposed to answer biochemistry essay questions. I'm going to teach you how Mr. Chandele expects you to answer his biochemistry essay questions. So this is gonna be an helpful video. Make sure you apply what I'm going to tell you. So the first thing that you have to do when writing an exam or when answering question papers, you have to understand the instructions, because the instructions are very important. They're the one that are going to tell you what you're supposed to do. So the instructions that we have here, there are two essay questions in this quiz. Answer one in the spaces provided. So we have got two essay questions and you need to choose only one question. Present your work neatly. Make sure your work is well presented and neatly presented. Total marks 25. So each question is carrying 25 marks. Duration is 30 minutes. So you need to make sure that you finish writing your essay within 30 minutes. Before we dive into the questions, we need to understand what does Mr. Chandele expect you to write in your essay. So your essay must be coherent. What do we mean when you say coherent? We mean that your essay must be written in an orderly manner. And your essay must be neat. But how are you supposed to write your essay? What should be in your essay? That's another question. So for me, when I'm writing an essay, or what I usually emphasize to students, when you're writing an essay, make sure always to start with the physiology part before you go to the pathology part. What is the physiology? Physiology is simply talking about how the body normally works. So you need to explain what happens in a normal cell, or what happens in a healthy human body, or what happens when a person is in an healthy state before going to the pathology. So talk about the normal before you talk about the abnormal. So make sure you explain. Let's say we are talking about diabetes. You need to explain the role of insulin in a normal human being, in a healthy human being. You need to explain what does insulin do. Okay, before you start talking about what happens when there is no insulin in diabetes, because we know that diabetes type 1 is actually the absence of insulin. So first start talking about the role of insulin. Talk about what does insulin do, how does it help glucose to enter into the cell. And then after you're done with that, go to the pathology. So talk about the absence of insulin in the pathology part. What happens if there is no insulin? That is why diabetes type 2 or type 1 is going to develop. Okay? Because that is going to help any person who is going to read your essay to understand what you're talking about. Even a layman can understand what you're talking about. Okay? So that is very important. So you're going to understand more on how to write Mr. Chandele's essay questions. When we send, actually, we are going to send to you some sample essays that you can go through and understand what Mr. Chandele expects from you. So let us get started. Question 1. The human body uses glucose in a number of processes. However, before glucose can be utilized by the blood cells, it needs to be transported across the membrane phospholipid bilayer. Explain how a molecule of glucose is transported across the phospholipid bilayer. So the reason why we've made this video, because we've heard that you're having a quiz on the 10th March. So this video is going to help you prepare. In other words, it's going to be like a guidance on how you're supposed to answer essay questions. And we've heard that your quiz is focusing on transport across the cell membrane. And this quiz was also focusing on the same thing. So probably same questions can come. Who knows? So the first question is, explain how a molecule of glucose is transported across the phospholipid bilayer. So the first thing that we need to understand, what makes up the phospholipid bilayer? The phospholipid bilayer is actually made up of fat acids, or what we call the phospholipids. So the phospholipids, they only allow certain molecules to cross, while they deny entry to certain molecules. So glucose is one of the molecules that cannot cross the cell membrane or the phospholipid bilayer on its own. But how is it transported into the cell? Because glucose is very vital for metabolic activities inside the cell. How does it enter into the cell? So it uses what we call transporters. Transporters, these are simply proteins that are embedded in the cell membrane or in the phospholipid bilayer. Why is it not able to cross on its own across the cell membrane? Why is it not able to cross the cell membrane? The reason is simple, because glucose, it is a polar molecule. What do we mean when we say polar molecule? We simply mean a molecule that dissolves in water. And the molecule that dissolves in water, they can't dissolve in the phospholipid bilayer. In other words, they can't cross the phospholipid bilayer. So glucose cannot cross the phospholipid bilayer on its own because it is a polar molecule. Okay? So it uses what we call transporters. So glucose is able to enter into the cell through two different types of processes. The first process is facilitated diffusion. The other process, it is secondary active transport. So we are going to look at these two processes. Let us start with the secondary active transport and understand how glucose is transported into the cell through this process. So before talking about the secondary active transport, we need to understand the primary active transport. So primary active transport, what is it? So just to talk about active transport, it is simply the movement of molecules or ions across the cell membrane against the concentration gradient, from a region where they're in low concentration to the region where they're in high concentration. So it is against the concentration gradient. So when you're talking about secondary active transport of glucose, the first thing we need to talk about is the primary active transport of sodium and potassium. So in the cell membrane, we have got this very important transporter, which is a pump. So this is what we call the sodium potassium ATPase. So this transporter, it is actually an enzyme that breaks down ATP. That's why it is called ATPase. So this pump, it's very important. How is it important? Important for the transportation of sodium and potassium across the cell membrane. So this transporter, it moves 3 sodium ions from the intracellular compartment to the extracellular compartment, from inside the cell to the outside of the cell. At the same time, it moves 2 potassium from outside the cell into inside the cell. So for it to do this, it uses ATP because it is moving these ions across the cell membrane against their concentration gradient. You should remember that outside the cell, we have got more sodium than inside the cell. And then we have more potassium inside the cell than outside the cell. So we're moving potassium from where it is less to where it is in abundance. Same applies to sodium. But as sodium is moving to the outside, we are creating a concentration gradient. And that concentration gradient, it is used in secondary active transport. So primary active transport and secondary active transport, they are only different in one way. Primary active transport, it uses ATP directly. But secondary active transport, it uses the concentration gradient that is created by primary active transport. So you can see that in primary active transport, we are creating the concentration gradient of sodium. Sodium, it is building up outside, and this is causing us to have more sodium outside the cell than inside the cell, and that is building the concentration gradient. So this sodium that's coming outside of the cell is going to be used to drive this channel that we have here, the sodium glucose channel or transporter. So this transporter, it depends on the concentration gradient of sodium as well as on the presence of glucose. So what will happen is that the sodium that's coming outside is going to bind to this sodium glucose transporter. And this transporter, it only works when both of these substances are available. When we have got sodium ion and the glucose, it cannot work when you only have sodium without glucose. And vice versa is true. So for this to work, you need to have sodium and glucose. So what happens is that this sodium that is building up outside the cell is going to bind to this sodium glucose transporter, and at the same time, glucose is also going to bind there. So when glucose and sodium ion bind to the sodium glucose transporter, it's going to rotate and transport sodium and glucose into the cell. This sodium can be driven back to the outside of the cell through the sodium potassium ATPase, and the process continues. So this is one way in which glucose is transported across the cell membrane into the cell. A transporter that transports 2 different types of molecules or ions in different directions or in opposite directions, it is called an antiporter. And that movement of molecules in opposite directions is called antiport. And then the one that transports 2 different types of molecules or ions in the same direction, it is called symporter. And that kind of movement, it is called symport. So this is a symporter and this is antiporter. Since we've talked about the activity of sodium potassium ATPases and its function as glucose is concerned, We need also to talk about the factors that affect this pump. What are the things that affect this pump? So the first thing that we can talk about is epinephrine. Epinephrine, this is an hormone that is produced by the adrenal gland. So epinephrine as well as norepinephrine, these are important hormones that affects your blood pressure. So epinephrine, it is actually produced when, let's say, when a person is scared, or when a person is trying to run away from danger. So this is the hormone that is produced. So what does it do? It actually increases your blood pressure, so that we have got a lot of blood that is going to other organs. Okay, so that we have got blood that is going to tissues. I've got enough blood going to the tissues. So enough blood going to tissues will result in enough oxygen supply, and that will result in ATP production that can help a person run away from that danger. So epinephrine is important in that way. Now we have got drugs that actually blocks the activity of epinephrine. These are called beta 2 antagonists. So beta 2 receptors antagonists, these are simply drugs that blocks the beta 2 receptors so that epinephrine cannot bind there. So what are some of these drugs? We've got propranolol and labetalol. So these drugs are actually used in patients who have got high blood pressure, hypertension, because we said the activity of epinephrine is to increase blood pressure. So how can you reduce blood pressure? By blocking the activity of epinephrine using these drugs that we are calling the beta 2 receptors antagonists. So what does these drugs do? These drugs, they actually convert ATP into cyclic AMP. And cyclic AMP has got an ultimate effect on the activity of sodium potassium ATPase. What's the ultimate effect? It increases the activity of sodium potassium ATPase. So beta 2 blockers, they actually increases the activity of sodium potassium ATPases. What else affects the activity of sodium potassium ATPase? It is this important hormone that we are calling insulin. Insulin is an hormone that is produced by the beta 2 cells of the pancreas. So this also, it increases the activity of sodium potassium ATPase. And insulin, remember, it is produced when you have got an elevated level of glucose in your body. Okay, when you're in a state that we call well-fed state. So after eating a meal rich in glucose, that glucose is going to stimulate the beta 2 receptors in the pancreas and tell them to produce insulin. So that insulin, why is it produced? It's produced because it's going to facilitate the transport of that same glucose into the cell. Okay, so insulin, it activates, or in other words, it increases the activity of sodium potassium ATPase. But what's the importance of that? The importance of that is that when the activity of this pump increases, you are going to have more potassium entering the cell and more sodium leaving the cell. And remember what I said? I said that the sodium glucose transporter, the one that transports glucose, its activity increases when you've got a large concentration gradient for sodium. So we have got more sodium leaving the cell than entering the cell. You are going to find that the activity of sodium glucose transporter is going to increase. Okay, so when we have got when the activity of sodium potassium ATPase increases, we are going to create a very large concentration gradient for sodium. And that large concentration gradient for sodium is going to drive the movement of glucose. It's going to drive the sodium glucose transporter so that it is able to transport glucose. So insulin is going to increase the activity of sodium potassium ATPase, and sodium potassium ATPase, what it's going to do is going to create a large concentration gradient for sodium. And that large concentration gradient for sodium is very important for the transport of glucose. So insulin, indirectly, it affects the movement of glucose in that way as well. But there is also a direct way that we're going to talk about. Okay. So this is what we can see here. Insulin increases the activity of sodium potassium ATPase, reducing serum potassium. Insulin overdose can cause hypokalemia. Okay? What does it mean? What is hypokalemia? Hypokalemia, it is simply low level of potassium outside the cell. So let's say that you give a patient an overdose of insulin. The activity of sodium potassium ATPase is going to increase, so more potassium is going to be taken from outside the cell into the cell. And that is going to reduce the amount of potassium outside the cell. So if it is reduced to a very low amount, beyond the normal amount, that's what we are calling hypokalemia. So let's say you're treating someone with diabetes, make sure that the amount of insulin you're giving that patient, the dosage, is okay. Because when you give that patient an overdose, it's going to bring other complications. The other thing that affects the sodium potassium ATPase that I've mentioned is beta 2 adrenergic, or what we are calling the beta 2 receptor blockers. So these are simply drugs. What do? They activate. They activate the sodium potassium ATPase. They increase its activity. How do they do that? They use the cyclic AMP. So the cyclic AMP, it intense increases the activity of sodium potassium ATPase. So these, they are very important. Okay, so these are very important. So when you give a patient an overdose of the labetalol, which is a drug used for hypertension, for high blood pressure, it can cause hypokalemia. So the dosage must be in the right amount. Okay, so make sure that you give the right amount of the drug to that patient, because if you give an overdose, it's going to cause other complications like hypokalemia. Now, let's talk about facilitated diffusion. Because if you remember, I mentioned that glucose is transported into the cell through two processes. We have got facilitated diffusion and secondary active transport. So I've talked about secondary active transport. Now we need to talk about facilitated diffusion. But before we talk about this whole process, first we need to talk about a very important hormone that I mentioned, which is insulin. So insulin, this is a hormone that is produced by the beta 2 cells in the pancreas. So it is produced when these cells are stimulated by high level of glucose. So once it is produced, this insulin, it comes and it binds on the insulin receptors that are found on cells. So it can be cells such as myocytes. Myocytes, these are simply muscle cells, skeletal muscle cells. These insulin receptors can also be found on adipocytes, which are simply fat cells, and other types of cells as well. So when insulin binds on the receptor, what does it do? It undergoes different cascades of reactions, and then it's going to send signals. What are those signals? It's going to send signals in the cytosol. So those signals can have these effects. They can have effects on protein metabolism, they can have effects on growth, and effects on lipid metabolism. But the main important in this case that we are focusing on is the effect of insulin on GLUT4 transporter expression. So what is GLUT4 transporter? So we have got these transporters. Remember what I said, the transporter is simply a protein. So we have got these transporters in cells that are used to transport glucose. They are called GLUT transporters. So we have got different types of transporters. So the GLUT is actually like a family of these proteins. Okay, they're actually proteins. And we have got GLUT1 transporter, GLUT2 up to GLUT9 somewhere there. So there are a lot, and these are found in different cells. So in myocytes, which are muscle cells, as well as adipocytes, which are fat cells, we have got GLUT4 transporters. GLUT4 transporters. Why are we talking about skeletal muscle cells and fatty cells? The reason is simple, because these cells are the cells that uses glucose the most. That's where most of your ATP is generated. In skeletal cells, you're always using your muscles to move, to do things. You're always using your muscles. So your muscles, they use a lot of ATP, and that's why most of the ATP is generated in the body. That's why they need glucose. Okay, that's why we are focusing on these. We're focusing on GLUT4 transporters that are found in these cells. So these GLUT4 transporters, you should remember that they are found inside the cell. These proteins, they're found inside the cell. Unlike the sodium potassium ATPase that are embedded in the cell membrane, these GLUT4 transporters, they are actually found inside the cell, in the cytosol. So what happens that when insulin binds there, it's going to send a signal into the intracellular matrix and tell the cell to what? To send these GLUT4 transporters to the cell membrane. So the cell is going to send these transporters. Now they are embedded in this vesicle. So this is a vesicle. So they are going to be transported and brought here. So once they reach the cell membrane, this vesicle is going to fuse with the cell membrane. And these GLUT4 transporters are going to be embedded in the cell membrane, as you can see there. So what you should remember was that the GLUT4 transporters, they're found inside the cell and not on the cell membrane. So these are proteins that transport glucose that are found inside the cell. And they come and bind to the cell membrane when insulin binds to the receptors. Okay. So once they bind to the cell membrane, glucose is able to move from the region of high concentration to the region of low concentration. That's why it is diffusion. But we're saying it's facilitated diffusion. Facilitated means it requires some help. Okay, it requires some help. This type of diffusion that requires some help. From where? From these proteins that we're calling GLUT4 transporters. Okay, so this is called facilitated diffusion because it uses these channels. They're actually channel proteins, the GLUT4 transporters. So without these, glucose cannot enter. So we've talked about two things that the glucose uses for it to cross the phospholipid bilayer. So it uses the sodium glucose transporter and the GLUT4 transporters, or the GLUT transporters. So once it enters inside the cell, that is where glucose now is used in metabolic activities such as glycolysis. It is used in glycogenesis and other processes. Okay. So we have explained how glucose is transported into the cells. So if they ask you explain how glucose is transported into the cell, make sure you talk about the secondary active transport, and you also talk about the GLUT4 transporters. These are the two processes in which glucose is transported into the cell.